Hi, my name is Rochelle. I chose to do part two of the oral presentation, the comparing and contrasting of two films. The first film I chose was Salt of the Earth, which we viewed at the beginning of the semester, and the more newer film that I chose was Cesar Chavez. Both of these films tell the stories of strikers and the struggles that they endured while fighting for their equality and better working conditions. Salt of the Earth is based on the miners' strike of 1951 against the Empire Zinc Company. During this strike, the miners were fighting for better working conditions and safer working conditions in the mines. Although this film starts out as being a fight for the miners' equality and working conditions, we also see in this film that the women are also fighting for equality for themselves. This was a big time of racial tension and discrimination against women, so the fight for equal rights was a big deal at this time. A lot of activist groups were forming to help gain exposure to these groups wanting equality. Same as Salt of the Earth, Cesar Chavez was also a film in our time in history where the workers were speaking out against big companies. They wanted equality, and they also wanted better working conditions. A lot of these farm workers worked long hours for little pay, so this just was not a good situation for them. So Cesar Chavez formed a group of people to strike out against these working conditions in hopes to make a better future for their future generations. One of the differences between Salt of the Earth was the way that the women were welcomed. The differences between Salt of the Earth and Cesar Chavez was the way that the women were welcomed. In the beginning of Salt of the Earth, the women were not welcomed on the strike lines. The men felt that the women, they belonged in the home, taking care of the household chores and the children. Later on in the film, though, that we do see that the women end up taking over the picket lines for the men in the film Salt of the Earth. That way the men do not get arrested and thrown in jail. In Cesar Chavez, though, the women are welcomed from the beginning to be part of the strike, because a lot of these women, they did work on these farms, so they were part of the harsh working conditions. They experienced all these bad times. One of the co-founders that came together with Cesar Chavez to help, make this strike happen and help create the union. Her name was actually Dolores Huerta. Her and Cesar Chavez came together to found the National Farm Workers Association, which happened in 1962, which is later named the United Farm Workers Union. So you can see there was a huge difference by the way these women were welcomed in different times. Even though the public viewed the women differently because it was different times, I did notice that the way Ramon in Salt of the Earth viewed Esperanza was very similar at the way that Cesar Chavez viewed his wife, Helen. These two women offered to help put themselves in harm's way of being arrested and put in jail, and both these men pretty much replied with, well, who will take care of the household and the children? We see in Salt of the Earth that Esperanza does end up going on the strike lines, and she eventually does get arrested and put in jail, and Ramon has to take care of household chores and the children. In Cesar Chavez, Helen offers to go on the strike lines and scream huelga, which means strike in Spanish, because huelga, that word, was banned from being said on the strike lines by authorities and the government. She offers to go on the strike lines, and she yells this word over and over until she is eventually arrested. So that was one similarity in these two films. Another similarity was that the violence that these strikers endured from authorities, that it was just very actions that weren't necessary. All these strikers were mainly calm, and they were nonviolent. A lot of the authorities and the law enforcement, they they basically came out. These strikers were very violent tendencies. They would use their vehicles to ram the strike lines. They would shoot their guns into the air, and actually in Cesar Chavez, some of the authorities shot at the strikers, injuring them. There was another episode in Cesar Chavez where the growers brought their pesticide trucks around the strikers and ended up blasting the strikers with pesticides, which harmed the strikers. It was often that Cesar Chavez, he would challenge the authorities and the government, asking them if they even read the Constitution or the Bill of Rights, because a lot of these actions that our government and authorities were doing was very unconstitutional, and it just wasn't right. Both of these strikes, they supported a nonviolent way of doing things, even though that they were met with a lot of violence. Cesar Chavez said that his strike was meant to be an economic and nonviolent weapon to help gain their objectives. He even went on a 25-day hunger strike when there was one point where some of his strikers took violent actions back towards these authorities, and Cesar Chavez did not like that at all. So he went on a 25-day hunger strike until all of his strikers signed a nonviolent agreement. So I thought that was pretty interesting, especially compared to nowadays when strikes and these protests are really violent, and sometimes it can get out of hand. Even though these two strikes were very similar in nature, one big thing that was pretty different was the publicity of these two. The strike of the of the miners was very small. It was focused on one company, one area. There wasn't a lot of word to get out there to the surrounding areas. As far as the Cesar Chavez and his strikers went, there was a lot more involvement, and this strike was basically statewide in California. They even band with the Filipinos, the Filipino farm workers, to make their strike even larger. That way they could hurt the growers even more. Cesar Chavez also had the advantage of using, they had the telephone, so they were able to communicate statewide, nationwide, and they also had the newspaper, so they were able to communicate, and they would make cartoons for those strikers who weren't able to read. So they were able to get their point across through cartoons also. The strike with Cesar Chavez, it actually ended up being nationwide and worldwide. He had the support of different church groups, different political leaders, a lot of housewives. They eventually started a boycott. That way they could take down one company at a time to gain ground in a more organized fashion. Cesar Chavez actually gained the support of Robert Kennedy. He did not support the way that these strikers were being met with violence and just the way that they were being treated at all. Ironically, after Senator Robert Kennedy was shot, things kind of turned for the worse for the strikers, though, because a lot of the government officials would turn a blind eye on some very unnecessary force that was being put on them. Richard Nixon actually made an agreement with these growers to take the grapes that were not being sold here in the United States and sell them to Europe. And then what grapes that weren't sold to Europe, he would take and buy, the government would buy to feed to our troops at the time. The funny thing is because is that Cesar Chavez actually traveled to Europe to create a boycott over there towards these grapes. The Europeans, they did not support any of these harsh working conditions that the strikers were striking against, so they actually ended up boycotting the grape companies also. So basically this is what led to the agreement between the growers and the strikers being signed. So that was a good thing. It was just amazing how he took, what started in a small city called Delano, and then he ended up nationwide and going to worldwide. And that was very, very amazing. Another similarity that I found that was quite interesting was this was a huge time for the Red Scare, which is a communist scare. We were in the Cold War at this time, so actually Salt of the Earth got banned and blacklisted by the government when it was first made, because the government felt that the filmmakers were communists and they were trying to spread lies and secrets, and so they blacklisted Salt of the Earth from being produced and made. And in Cesar Chavez, a lot of the government officials claim that the organizers of the strikes are communists and they were trying to create chaos, and a lot of the things that they were trying to get the other farm workers to join in on their strike were lies. And so I felt that the common ground that they had with the Red Scare communist mentality was pretty interesting. As far as aesthetics goes, I feel that both films did a great job in portraying like the ugly truth that this time in our history was. This was a harsh time for different racial groups and for women at the time. So these different people in the films did a great job actually portraying to me like the feelings that they felt. For example, Esperanza, at the beginning she was very timid and she didn't speak up much, but as the film went on, we could see her pride and her confidence growing in her. And at the end, to me, she looked like a totally different woman. She just gained everything, and she was very happy that she was finally gaining equality and gaining a voice for her and her fellow women. In Cesar Chavez, I could feel his pain. I felt everything that his frustrations. It was just amazing how he took a little group and then grew huge. He was you could feel how upset he was when he had to go on the hunger strike. You could feel his pain, not only medically, but like the pain of him having the fear of failing and having to face his family. I thought these filmmakers and these actors did a great job portraying this to the viewers of what really happened in our history. All in all, I found these two films to be very educational. I would recommend these two films to anybody who wants to learn about their history and the history of farm workers and different racial groups and different gender groups. So I hope you guys go out and watch these two films. Thank you for your time.